think back to the last interaction you had with a government agency. Maybe it was online, maybe in person.
Hmm.
Did you leave feeling like things were efficient and helpful, or maybe a little frustrated by red tape?
Yeah.
That word bureaucracy, it often brings up these mixed feelings. We need the services, but sometimes the process can feel, well, bureaucratic.
Absolutely. It's that fascinating duality, isn't it? We rely on these systems for so much, yet the inner workings can seem, well, opaque and sometimes even intentionally complicated.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to take a deep dive into this entity that's often called the fourth branch of government, the bureaucracy, using the sources you shared with us as our guide.
Right. And our mission here is pretty simple, to give you a clear, sort of no-nonsense understanding of what this massive administrative world actually is, how it evolved over time, and why it's so incredibly important to how our country functions.
Exactly. We're talking about a huge number of dedicated experts, not elected officials, who are really the backbone of getting things done.
So we'll be tackling the big questions. What do these folks actually do day to day? Who are they, and how do they end up in these roles? How do the laws passed by our elected leaders actually get turned into real-world programs?
Yeah, and who's behind the rules that shape so much of our lives? Okay, let's unpack this. So, to start us off, what exactly is a bureaucracy, and is this some, like, modern invention?
Yeah, it feels like a very 20th or 21st century thing sometimes, doesn't it?
Well, interestingly, bureaucracy, at its heart, is simply an administrative group of non-elected officials who are responsible for carrying out policies and programs.
Okay.
The individuals who work within this system are known as bureaucrats, or civil servants. And while the scale and complexity might feel very modern, the concept itself has been around for millennia.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Think about the scribes in ancient Egypt who kept track of grain stores, or the tax collectors mentioned in the Bible. These were early, essential forms of bureaucratic organization.
Wow, so it really does go way back. I guess I always pictured it as something that just appeared with the rise of big government.
Not quite. In fact, in Europe, the study and practice of government administration actually predates the widespread adoption of democratic systems. What's fascinating is that in the United States, we established our democracy and the Constitution first, and then our national governmental organizations, including our bureaucracy, developed as the need arose.
Oh, okay.
This long history really emphasizes that having some kind of structured administrative system is fundamental to making any government work.
Okay, so it's ancient and essential.
Yeah.
But what does a modern bureaucracy actually do in practical terms? What's its function today?
Right. In our modern complex society, we rely heavily on a functioning government to provide essential public goods, things like infrastructure, national defense,
Sure.
to improve our overall quality of life, and to help foster economic growth. The bureaucracy is absolutely crucial in achieving these goals.
So, like, give me some examples.
Okay, think about everything from collecting taxes and ensuring homeland security to managing immigration, conducting our foreign policy, and overseeing education. As our society has become more interconnected and the demand for government services has grown, so too have the challenges of what we call public administration.
Public administration, so that's the actual, on-the-ground work of running the government effectively.
Exactly. It's both the practical side of implementing public policy within government agencies and also the academic field that trains people to do this work as civil servants.
Right.
The classic model of how a bureaucracy is structured is hierarchical, meaning there's a clear chain of command.
Like a pyramid.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It also typically involves a separation of tasks, with individuals specializing in specific roles, and ideally each employee reports to only one supervisor. You see this kind of organizational chart not just in government, but also in private companies and nonprofit organizations too. Although, obviously, the lines of accountability and their ultimate missions can be quite different.
That makes sense. You see those org charts everywhere. So how did this whole bureaucratic thing get off the ground here in the U.S.? We didn't exactly inherit a massive administrative structure, did we?
No, not at all. The U.S. bureaucracy started very small in the early days of the Republic. And this is understandable, really, given that the American Revolution was, in many ways, a reaction against a powerful executive and that extensive British imperial administration.
Right. They were wary of that.
Exactly. Now, while the word bureaucracy isn't explicitly in the Constitution, the document definitely lays the groundwork for it. For example, Article 2 gives the president the power to appoint officers and department heads.
Okay.
And it also mandates that the president must ensure the laws are faithfully executed. And then Article 1, Section 8 grants Congress powers like establishing a post office and regulating commerce, which, inherently implies the need for some kind of administrative capacity.
Right. So the need was there from the start, even if there wasn't a detailed blueprint for a huge bureaucracy. Who were the key figures and what were the initial steps?
Well, under President George Washington, the bureaucracy was deliberately kept lean, just enough to handle the most pressing needs of the new nation.
Makes sense.
His administration saw the creation of the Department of State to manage foreign affairs, the Department of the Treasury to handle finances, and the Department of War for the military.
The big three, basically.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Along with the Postal Service, the people working in these areas made up the core of the federal bureaucracy for the first few decades. However, two major shifts really propelled its growth beyond those initial stages.
Okay, what were those pivotal changes?
The first was the rise of centralized political parties in the 1820s. Under President Andrew Jackson, we saw the beginnings of what's known as the spoils system.
Ah, the spoils system. Heard of that.
Yeah. This was essentially a practice where political appointments became a form of patronage, handed out by the president largely based on loyalty to his political party.
So, jobs for the boys, basically.
Kind of. The thinking was that the government would run more effectively if key positions were held by people who already supported the president and his policies. It was also a way to build party unity, as people's livelihoods became linked to the party's success.
The spoils system. That sounds like it had the potential to get pretty messy, right? So it wasn't about whether you were qualified, but who you knew or who you supported politically.
Exactly. It prioritized political loyalty over merit. That was the key difference. The second major development was the rapid industrialization of the U.S. in the late 19th century.
Right, the railroads, telegraphs.
Precisely. The country experienced significant growth in population and economic activity, leading to the expansion of cities and an increasing need for federal involvement, particularly with those booming railway and telegraph industries. The government and its growing bureaucracy played a key role in providing land and other concessions to these Western railway companies, which really set the stage for the kind of regulatory frameworks we would see develop later.
So industrialization created the need for more bureaucracy, but the spoils system dictated who would fill those roles. What were the practical consequences of that?
Well, look, while the spoils system did arguably create a government that was more directly responsive to the will of the electorate.
Oh, interesting point.
And it even helped to keep voter turnout high. Because there was so much at stake in elections, it also had some significant downsides.
Like what?
Well, it fostered a system where people sought government jobs by pledging their loyalty to political patrons, and this could divert government resources towards maintaining that system of rewards. It moved away from an earlier approach where intellectual and economic elites were often appointed based on their qualifications. By the mid-1870s, there was growing public criticism, particularly after a series of well-publicized scandals during President Ulysses S. Grant's administration really highlighted the inefficiencies and the potential for corruption inherent in the spoils system.
Scandals definitely have a way of focusing people's attention. So what was the turning point? What led to a change?
The assassination of President James Garfield in 1881 by a disgruntled man who felt he was owed a government job, that really brought the issue to a head.
Wow.
The public outcry for reform was intense, and it led Congress to pass the Pendleton Act, also known as the Civil Service Reform Act of 1883.
The Pendleton Act. Okay.
This was a really significant piece of legislation. It established the Civil Service Commission, a central agency tasked with ensuring that federal government hiring, retention, and promotion practices were based on a merit system, using open and competitive examinations.
Ah, exams.
Yeah. This act truly marked a major shift away from the spoils system.
So the Pendleton Act was all about moving towards a system based on what you could do, not who you knew.
Precisely. It made it illegal to fire or otherwise punish government workers for purely political reasons, and it raised the qualifications for employment by requiring applicants to pass exams that demonstrated their competence for the job.
And the commission itself, how was that set up?
The Civil Service Commission itself was designed to be bipartisan, with commissioners responsible for developing and administering these exams, ensuring a fair distribution of appointments across the different states, and prohibiting the coercion of civil servants to make political contributions.
Okay.
Initially, only about 10% of the government workforce fell under the Commission's control. But that percentage grew substantially in the following decades.
So it took time to roll out.
It did. But this wasn't just a change in hiring practices. It started to cultivate a culture of professionalism within the civil service. Although, The push and pull with political appointees continues to shape how agencies function and prioritize their work even now.
That must have had a huge impact. Presidents no longer had to spend all their time dealing with job applications, I imagine.
That's part of it, yeah.
And civil servants probably had a bit more job security, right?
Exactly. With job security no longer solely dependent on the shifting political winds, civil servants began to organize. They formed groups like the National Association of All Civil Service Employees in 1896 to push for further reforms, particularly focusing on strengthening job security and maintaining independence from political parties.
Interesting. So they started acting collectively.
Yes, and over time, many also gravitated towards labor unions, gaining political influence through collective action, especially after the Lloyd-La Follette Act of 1912 eased restrictions on union membership for civil servants.
It sounds like this transition to a merit-based system was a gradual and evolving process. Where does Woodrow Wilson fit into all of this? I know he's often associated with, good government and efficiency.
Absolutely. President Woodrow Wilson, a leading figure in the progressive movement, is often considered a foundational thinker in the field of U.S. public administration. With a strong academic background in history and political science, he believed deeply in the importance of public service. He argued that effectively running a constitutional government in an increasingly complex world was becoming as challenging as, establishing one.
Interesting perspective.
Wilson advocated for a clear separation between politics and administration as a way to maximize efficiency and effectiveness in government. He believed that public administration should be grounded in a science of management.
Like a science.
Yeah, using comparisons with private sector organizations, adopting business-like practices, and investing in the training of professional managers, while still, importantly, being responsive to public opinion.
So his vision was for a professional, nonpartisan civil service focused on getting the job done effectively, almost like a well-run business.
That was the ideal he put forward. While he acknowledged that a complete separation of politics and administration might be difficult to fully achieve in practice.
Probably impossible, yeah.
That was the direction he strongly advocated for. Now, this groundwork laid in the late 19th and early 20th centuries really paved the way for significant bureaucratic growth later on. We saw the creation of important agencies like the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Federal Reserve Board, and the Federal Trade Commission during this period, reflecting the growing role of the federal government in regulating the economy and society.
And then came the Great Depression, which I can only imagine led to another massive expansion of government and the bureaucracy to handle all the new programs.
You're absolutely right. The devastating economic impact of the Great Depression in 1929 led to unprecedented levels of unemployment and hardship across the country.
Just unimaginable.
Yeah. The response under President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his New Deal initiatives involved a massive expansion of government programs designed to stimulate the economy and provide direct relief to struggling Americans.
The New Deal, right.
Yeah. This era saw the creation of crucial agencies like the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, to protect bank deposits, the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, to oversee labor relations, the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, to regulate the stock market, and the Civil Aeronautics Board, CAB, to regulate the airline industry.
Wow, a lot of familiar names there.
Absolutely. By 1940, the number of federal employees had grown dramatically to around 700,000.
That's a huge leap in a relatively short time. And then the trend continued, right? I remember reading about President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society programs in the 1960s.
Yes, under President Lyndon B. Johnson in the 1960s, the federal bureaucracy experienced another substantial surge in size and scope, reaching a peak of around 2.2 million employees.
2.2 million.
With a federal budget that exceeded $332 billion. This growth was largely driven by Johnson's ambitious Great Society initiatives, which aimed to use the power of the federal government to combat poverty and promote social welfare through landmark programs like the Economic Opportunity Act, Medicare, and significant increases in federal funding for education.
Right. Medicare, education funding, big stuff.
Yeah. Naturally, the implementation and administration of all these new programs required a significant increase in the number of government employees.
And that inevitably led to a reaction, I suppose. I distinctly remember hearing about President Ronald Reagan's efforts in the 1980s to try and shrink the size of government.
Absolutely. The increasing size and perceived cost of the federal bureaucracy became a major point of concern for conservatives, culminating in the election of Ronald Reagan, who explicitly promised to reduce its size and scope.
Did he succeed?
Well, while he did manage to achieve some cuts in certain areas, His focus on strengthening national defense during the Cold War also led to significant increases in military spending.
Ah, right, the Cold War buildup.
Yeah. The end of the Cold War in the early 1990s did spark discussions about a potential peace dividend with the possibility of reducing military expenditures. However, the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 ushered in a new era of massive investment in defense and homeland security, leading to further bureaucratic growth in those areas.
So it's like one step forward, one step back almost, or growth in different areas.
It seems like this constant push and pull growth in response to crises or new national priorities, followed by efforts to cut back and streamline, has been a recurring theme throughout the history of the bureaucracy.
Yeah, definitely.
The 1970s, marked by increasing economic competition from countries like Germany and Japan, rapid technological advancements, and rising inflation created a sense of anxiety and insecurity among many American workers.
Right.
There was a growing sentiment that some government welfare programs might be inefficient or overly burdensome. Political figures like Ronald Reagan effectively tapped into this public discontent, often criticizing what he characterized as bureaucratic waste and overreach.
I remember that famous quote.
He famously quipped in 1986 that the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help."
Right, that one.
While the actual reduction in the overall size of government under Reagan is a subject of ongoing debate among historians, his anti-bureaucracy rhetoric proved to be a very potent political tool.
It's really fascinating to see how these major historical forces have shaped the bureaucracy that we have today. So, after this long and sometimes contentious evolution, what are the key principles of our merit-based civil service in the present day? What's the core idea now?
Well, the fundamental principle is that the vast majority of government jobs are intended to be filled based on individuals' qualifications, their demonstrated skills, and their ability to meet the specific needs of the hiring organization, rather than on political connections or personal favors. This shift away from the spoils system, which we discussed earlier, is absolutely central. We now have carefully regulated hiring and pay practices designed to ensure that the most competent and qualified individuals are selected for each role.
And the Pendleton Act really laid the groundwork for this entire merit-based system, didn't it? You mentioned the Civil Service Commission. How exactly did that original commission function?
The Pendleton Act was indeed foundational. As we discussed, its primary goals were to reduce political influence in federal hiring and promotions, to raise the overall qualifications of government employees, and it established the Civil Service Commission, CSC, as the independent body responsible for enforcing these principles. CSE was made up of bipartisan commissioners who were tasked with developing and administering open and competitive examinations for a wide range of civil service positions.
Right, the exams.
They also had a mandate to ensure that appointments were fairly distributed geographically across the states, and that civil servants were protected from being coerced into making political contributions. Initially, the Pendleton Act only covered a relatively small percentage of federal jobs, maybe 10%, but its scope gradually expanded over time.
Okay.
The CSE also introduced the concept of a probationary period for new appointees and prohibited them from using their official authority to try and influence political elections.
So this commission was the main body overseeing federal hiring for a significant period, like decades.
It was, for many decades. But as we touched on earlier, concerns about the effectiveness and responsiveness of the merit system continued to arise. In 1978, the Civil Service Reform Act led to the abolishment of the Civil Service Commission.
Oh, okay. So it was replaced.
Yes. In its place, it created 2 new key federal agencies. The Office of Personnel Management, or OPM, which took over the personnel management functions, the sort of HR side of things.
Right, OPM, I've heard of them.
And the Merit Systems Protection Board, or MSPB, which is responsible for investigating allegations of wrongdoing within the civil service and hearing appeals from federal employees, kind of the watchdog and appeals body.
Right, OPM handles the nuts and bolts of hiring, and MSPB acts as a kind of internal watchdog and appeals court. That makes sense in terms of separating those functions. So when someone applies for a civil service job today, what does that application process typically involve? Is it still all exams?
Not entirely. Today, the hiring process is heavily focused on meeting the specific needs of the hiring agency. Civil service positions are advertised with very detailed job descriptions that outline the agency's mission, the specific responsibilities of the position, and the required KSAs, that's knowledge, skills, and abilities that are considered essential for success in the role.
KSAs. Okay.
For example, a job posting for a budget analyst might list specific KSAs, such as experience with federal financial systems and a thorough understanding of budgetary regulations. Applicants are then evaluated based on how well their background and experience demonstrate these KSAs.
So it's more about matching experience to the job needs.
Largely, yes. While the Pendleton Act initially mandated the use of civil service exams for many positions, now around 85% of federal jobs are filled by assessing an applicant's education, work history, and demonstrated KSAs through application materials and interviews.
Okay, so exams aren't totally gone, but less central.
Exactly. Standardized exams are still used for certain types of positions that require broad critical thinking skills, like those in the Foreign Service, or very specific technical knowledge, such as air traffic controllers.
Ah, that makes sense.
And the increasing use of online testing has also become a common way for agencies to screen a large number of applicants efficiently. Investing in ongoing training and professional development is also seen as crucial for maintaining a high-quality civil service. Human capital.
So it's really about demonstrating that you have the specific skills and experience the job requires. What about moving up within the government? Are there clear career paths, different types of service?
Yes, the federal government has different categories of employment. The competitive service is the most common, and these positions are generally regulated by OPM. Qualifications for these roles typically include your work history, your educational background, and sometimes the results of competitive exams.
Okay, competitive service. What else?
Then there's the accepted service. This includes positions that are exempt from many of these strict OPM rules, often because they require highly rigorous hiring processes or very specialized skills.
Like intelligence agencies.
Yeah, exactly, as you might find at agencies like the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. These agencies often have their own specific pay rates and hiring procedures.
Okay. And you mentioned top leadership.
Right. Then there's the Senior Executive Service, or SES, which encompasses top-level leadership positions across the federal government. Appointment to the SES requires demonstrating a set of executive core qualifications, or ECQs.
ECQs?
Yeah, things like the ability to lead change, drive results, demonstrate business acumen, and build effective coalitions. It's about proven leadership ability.
And how does the pay structure work for most civil servants? I've heard of the General Schedule, or GS, system. Is that still the main thing?
Yes, the vast majority of civil servants are paid according to the Federal General Schedule, often referred to as the GS pay schedule.
Okay, how does that work?
It's essentially a standardized pay scale with 15 grades, running vertically, that represent different levels of responsibility, required qualifications, and complexity of work.
15 grades. Got it.
And within each grade, there are also 10 steps running horizontally, which primarily reflect an employee's seniority and time in service within that grade.
Steps for seniority. Okay.
As we mentioned, the Pendleton Act laid the initial groundwork for a standardized federal pay system, and the modern GS system, with its refinements, has evolved from that foundation. Lower GS grades, like GS1 and GS2, typically have more basic requirements and lower pay levels.
Entry level.
Right. While higher grades, from GS13 through GS15, require increasingly specialized expertise and offer the highest salaries within the GS system.
So you move up grades and steps.
Generally, yes. Employees usually start at the first step of their assigned grade and can progress through the steps over time based on satisfactory job performance and length of service. Many career paths also allow for employees to advance through the different GS grades as they gain experience and take on more complex responsibilities.
So the intended benefits of all these detailed hiring practices and pay systems are, presumably, to bring in competent and dedicated individuals who can become long-term experts in their fields. Makes sense. But are there any potential downsides or unintended consequences of such a structured system?
Yeah, there are certainly potential drawbacks to consider. One key concern is that individuals in permanent civil service positions can sometimes become somewhat insulated from the direct influence of elected political leaders and the immediate pressures of public opinion.
A bit detached.
Well, while a degree of professional independence is certainly intended and can be beneficial for ensuring continuity and expertise, too much insulation can potentially lead to bureaucracies that are slow to adapt to changing political priorities or public needs. Another potential issue is what's sometimes referred to as bureaucratic chauvinism. The idea that the accepted expertise and established ways of doing things within a particular bureaucracy can sometimes overshadow new evidence, different perspectives, or even unintentionally perpetuate biases.
Like, we've always done it this way.
Kind of. While the merit system aims for objectivity, It can sometimes inadvertently foster a degree of groupthink or a prioritization of internal norms and procedures over external demands or innovative approaches. There's also the subtle but real potential for career bureaucrats to gradually steer the implementation of policies in directions that align with their own professional preferences, even if those don't perfectly mirror the initial intentions of elected officials. So while aiming for competence and dedication, these systems also create a complex dynamic with political oversight.
That tension between political direction from elected officials and the expertise within the bureaucracy seems like a constant balancing act in our system of government. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about how sociologists approach understanding these complex organizations. Are there different models they use to analyze how bureaucracies function?
Yes, sociologists have developed several different models to help us analyze the inner workings of bureaucracies and the motivations of the people who work within them. As you pointed out, the shift from the politically driven spoils system to a more merit-based civil service significantly altered the underlying dynamics and motivations within these organizations, and these models try to capture those different perspectives.
Tell me about the classic one. I think you mentioned the Weberian model earlier, Max Weber.
Yes, the Weberian model, developed by the influential early German sociologist Max Weber, is often considered the ideal type of bureaucracy in sociological analysis.
Ideal type, meaning perfect.
Not necessarily perfect, but like a pure model, a benchmark. Weber argued that as societies become more complex and industrialized, there's an increasing demand for specialized expertise and efficient administration in government. Therefore, the ideal bureaucracy, in his view, is one that operates in a rational and impartial manner.
Rational and impartial. Okay.
It's characterized by being apolitical, strictly hierarchical with a clear chain of command, and operates based on formal, standardized rules and procedures. In this model, specialized bureaucrats are selected based on their technical qualifications and use logical reasoning to solve problems efficiently.
Right.
The goals are to eliminate favoritism and patronage, prevent arbitrary decision-making, create order and predictability, ensure clear accountability, and limit the potential for individual discretion. For Weber, bureaucracy wasn't just a necessary feature of modern society, but also potentially a positive development that could contribute to greater efficiency and fairness.
So a very rational, by-the-book kind of organization where everything is clearly defined and decisions are based on logic, not personal connections. Sounds good in theory. Are there other sociological perspectives that take a less idealistic view of how bureaucracies operate in the real world?
Absolutely. Later sociologists developed alternative models that offer a more critical or nuanced perspective. One important model is the acquisitive model.
Acquisitive, like acquiring things.
Exactly. This view posits that bureaucracies, like any other large organization, are inherently competitive and power-hungry entities. Bureaucrats, particularly those at higher levels within an agency, understand that current resources are finite, so they will actively strive to expand the budget, increase the staff, and enhance the overall status and influence of their own particular bureaucracy.
Protect their turf.
Yeah, sometimes even at the expense of other agencies. This can manifest in various ways, from aggressively emphasizing the importance of their agency's mission to Congress during budget negotiations, to a tendency to spend the entirety of their allocated budget each year.
Use it or lose it.
Right. To make it more difficult for legislators to justify cutting their funding in the future. This model suggests that bureaucracies have a natural inclination to grow and accumulate resources, potentially leading to inefficiencies and spending beyond what might be strictly necessary.
That certainly resonates with some of the criticisms you often hear about government spending and the growth of government agencies. What's another way that sociologists look at the functioning of bureaucracies?
Another significant model is the monopolistic model. This perspective argues that the lack of significant competition, rather than the competition for resources, is the key factor in understanding how some government bureaucracies operate.
Lack of competition. How so?
Well, think again about an organization like the Bureau of Consular Affairs, which is responsible for issuing U.S. passports. For American citizens, there is no other legitimate source for obtaining a valid U.S. passport.
True. You have to go through them.
Right. Because the BCA essentially holds a monopoly on this essential service, there's less external pressure or incentive for the agency to become significantly more efficient, more responsive to customer service needs, or to dramatically speed up the passport application and issuance process. Does the lack of direct competition contribute to some of the frustrations you might have encountered with similar government services in the past.
That makes perfect sense when you put it that way. If you're the only game in town, there's probably less urgency to constantly improve or streamline things, like the DMV sometimes feels.
Exactly. With limited or no direct competition, these types of bureaucracies may face less pressure to adopt cost-saving measures, implement robust performance management systems, or be particularly responsive to citizen complaints. While some might argue that introducing privatization or market-based mechanisms could address this issue by creating competition, bureaucrats themselves are not always convinced of the benefits or feasibility of such approaches. There are a few rare exceptions where government agencies might compete for things like presidential favor or attention, CIA and NSA, perhaps. But generally, most bureaucracies operate in an environment with limited external competitive pressures. This lack of competition can sometimes lead to a slower pace of innovation and less responsiveness to the evolving needs of the public.
So we have these different sociological lenses, the ideal Weberian model, the competitive acquisitive model, and the monopolistic model through which we can understand how bureaucracies function, ranging from the ideal of rational efficiency to the realities of competition and the potential downsides of a lack of it.
Now let's turn to the actual types of bureaucratic organizations that we see within the U.S. government. What are the main categories? It's not all just one big blob, right?
No, definitely not. Within the U.S. federal government, despite the size and complexity, we can generally categorize bureaucratic organizations into four main types: cabinet departments, independent executive agencies, regulatory agencies, and government corporations.
Four types, okay. While they all operate within the framework of federal law and are subject to various forms of oversight, they have distinct structures, levels of autonomy, and specific functions within the government.
Okay, let's start with the cabinet departments. Those are the really large, well-known ones, right? Like the Department of State, the Department of Defense, the Treasury Department.
Exactly. There are currently 15 cabinet departments, and these represent the major executive branch offices that are directly accountable to the President of the United States.
Directly accountable to the President.
Yes. Each department is headed by a secretary, who is appointed by the President and must be confirmed by the Senate. These cabinet secretaries serve as key advisors to the President and are responsible for overseeing the vast network of agencies and offices within their respective departments, all working together to achieve the department's overall mission.
So they're big umbrellas.
Very much so. Within these large departments, you typically find a hierarchical structure with various levels of leadership, such as undersecretaries and assistant secretaries, each with their own specific areas of responsibility and oversight. It's worth noting that the Department of Justice is a bit of an exception. It's headed by the Attorney General rather than a secretary.
Ah, right. The AG.
If you look at the organizational chart of a cabinet department like the State Department, you'll see this tiered structure and the high degree of specialization within the various bureaus and offices.
So these departments are the big, broad mandate organizations, each with a specific area of responsibility that encompasses a wide range of activities. What about independent executive agencies? How are they different?
Independent executive agencies also report directly to the President, and their heads are also appointed by the President.
Okay, so similar there.
But, unlike cabinet departments, they tend to have a more focused set of responsibilities and are considered independent because they are not under the direct regulatory authority of any specific cabinet department. They perform vital functions that don't neatly fit within the scope of the major cabinet departments.
Got it. More specialized, like what?
Prominent examples include the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, for gathering foreign intelligence, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, for space exploration and scientific research, and the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, for environmental protection and regulation.
Okay, CIA, NASA, EPA. Big names, but independent. So they're more specialized in their focus and operate with a bit more autonomy from the traditional cabinet structure. Then we have regulatory agencies. These are the ones that are primarily responsible for making and enforcing rules and regulations in specific sectors, right? The rule makers.
That's correct. Regulatory agencies largely emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly during the Progressive Era, as a response to the challenges posed by rapid industrialization and the need to oversee key sectors of the economy.
Like the railroads we talked about earlier.
Exactly. The very first independent regulatory agency was the Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, established to regulate railroads. Other important examples include the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, CFTC, which oversees futures and options markets, the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, which regulates broadcasting and telecommunications,
FCC? Yeah.
and the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, which regulates the securities markets. These independent regulatory agencies are often designed to be somewhat insulated from direct partisan political influence.
Supposedly, anyway.
Well, that's the design, which allows them to develop a significant degree of expertise and authority within their specific areas of oversight. An agency like the SEC, for example, now has a very broad and complex mission in regulating the increasingly intricate world of financial markets, including those in the digital age. They can wield considerable power through the rules they create and enforce.
They definitely seem to have a substantial impact on various industries and aspects of our lives. Okay, and the last category is government corporations. That sounds almost like a hybrid between a government agency and a private business. Is that right?
That's a very accurate way to describe them. Government corporations are established by the federal government to run what are essentially quasi-business enterprises.
Quasi-business.
Yeah. They often provide services that are partly subject to market forces and are intended to generate enough revenue to be self-sustaining, but they also fulfill a vital public interest that the government has decided to maintain.
So part business, part public service.
Right. Unlike traditional private corporations, government corporations typically do not have stockholders, and any profits they generate are usually reinvested back into the enterprise rather than being distributed as dividends. They also often have certain exemptions, such as from some taxes.
Can you give me a couple of well-known examples of government corporations? I'm trying to picture this.
Sure. The United States Postal Service, USPS, is a prime example.
The post office?
Exactly. It was originally a cabinet department, but was reorganized into an independent government agency in the early 1970s with the goal of operating more like a business. While it's intended to be self-funding, it often finds itself at the center of political debates, as we've seen recently with the controversies surrounding Postmaster General DeJoy and changes to postal operations.
Yeah, definitely seen that. What's another one?
Another familiar example is Amtrak, the National Railroad Passenger Corporation. It was created by the federal government in 1971 to preserve passenger rail service in the United States at a time when private railroad companies were largely abandoning passenger routes because they were no longer profitable.
Right, to keep the trains running.
Exactly. So these government corporations operate with more business-like structures, but still serve a distinct public purpose.
So these four different types of organizations, cabinet departments, independent executive agencies, regulatory agencies, and government corporations, each have their own unique structures, levels of independence, and primary purposes within the overall framework of the U.S. government. Now, when we think about the people who work within these bureaucracies, the bureaucrats themselves, what can you tell us about them? What motivates them? Are they just paper pushers?
Well, it's really important to remember that bureaucrats are, by and large, citizens just like everyone else. They have similar personal needs and employment goals as people working in the private sector. However, research suggests that individuals who choose to pursue careers in the public sector often have a stronger sense of what's called public service motivation, PSM, public service motivation. This is essentially a genuine desire to contribute to the greater good of society and to find personal fulfillment through work that has a positive impact on others. It's a motivation that goes beyond just earning a paycheck.
That makes a lot of sense. It's probably not always about the highest possible salary for people who choose to work in government. There has to be something else driving them.
Exactly. Depending on the specific mission and responsibilities of their particular agency, bureaucrats can have an incredibly wide range of roles and daily tasks. They might be involved in anything from developing and enforcing regulations that protect the environment or ensure financial stability, to managing complex government programs that provide essential services to citizens, to conducting scientific research, or even directly assisting individuals in need.
A huge range.
Absolutely. Regardless of their specific job as government officials, they are all subject to a complex web of legislative regulations and internal procedural guidelines. Regulations are the broad rules and laws that dictate what individuals and corporations can and cannot do.
The big picture rules.
Right. To effectively implement these overarching regulations, bureaucracies develop detailed procedural guidelines, often referred to as standard operating procedures, or SOPs.
SOPs. Right.
Which are the very specific step-by-step instructions that lower-level bureaucrats must follow when carrying out their duties. For instance, a regulation might state that all nursing homes receiving federal funds must ensure a certain level of patient care.
Okay.
The relevant government agency would then develop detailed procedural guidelines outlining the specific protocols, record-keeping requirements, and inspection processes that nursing homes must adhere to in order to comply with that broader regulation.
And this whole intricate system of rules and procedures, that's what we often hear the public and the media refer to as red tape, right? All those steps.
That's precisely it. Red tape is a common term used to describe all of the formal rules, regulations, procedures, and documentation that must be followed to accomplish something within a bureaucracy.
And it gets a bad rap.
It often does. While it's often criticized by the public as being excessively time-consuming, inefficient, and frustrating, these rules are generally put in place with the intention of ensuring that bureaucracies function correctly, fairly, and with a degree of accountability. However, the sheer volume and complexity can sometimes lead to unintended delays and difficulties, no doubt about it.
Okay, so we have this enormous and incredibly complex bureaucracy guided by regulations and procedures. How do our elected leaders in Congress and the president actually go about trying to keep it in check and ensure it's doing what it's supposed to do? It seems like a monumental undertaking. How do you control something so vast?
It is indeed a significant and ongoing challenge, and as we've discussed, elected leaders have historically grappled with how to effectively oversee and control the bureaucracy, especially since the move away from the spoils system.
Right, because they don't just appoint everyone anymore.
Exactly. Part of the complexity arises from the fact that elected officials often have partisan political agendas and are subject to relatively short election cycles, while bureaucracies are ideally designed to be more nonpartisan and focused on long-term implementation. But over time, a variety of oversight mechanisms have been developed.
Okay, so let's start with the process of rulemaking itself. How does a bureaucratic agency actually go about creating the specific rules and regulations that businesses and individuals have to follow? How do they fill in the details Congress leaves out?
Right. When Congress passes a broad piece of legislation that authorizes a new government program or addresses a particular issue, the specific details of how that law will be implemented in the real world are often left to the relevant bureaucratic agencies. Yeah. When these agencies encounter ambiguities in the law or need to establish the specific requirements for compliance, they engage in rulemaking. Now, while there are different approaches, one increasingly common method, especially when dealing with complex or contentious issues, is negotiated rulemaking, often called REDNEG.
REDNEG, negotiated rulemaking.
Yeah. It's a more collaborative approach that has gained prominence in response to criticisms that traditional bureaucratic rulemaking can be overly adversarial and inefficient.
What was the traditional way?
Before the rise of negotiated rulemaking, the standard process was notice and comment rulemaking. An agency would publish its proposed rules in the Federal Register.
That big government publication.
Exactly, allowing the public and interested parties to submit formal comments. However, this process often became highly contentious, leading to lengthy delays, numerous lawsuits, and rules that didn't necessarily have broad support.
Sounds messy.
It could be. Negotiated rulemaking, or REGNEG, involves a neutral third-party convener bringing together a committee of representatives from all the significant stakeholder groups who will be affected by the proposed rule.
So everyone involved gets a seat at the table.
That's the idea. With the assistance of a neutral mediator, these diverse parties then try to reach a consensus on the specific language and provisions of the new rule. This consensus-based approach is often seen as a way to create more effective and less legally challenged regulations. The process is actually codified in a series of negotiated rulemaking acts.
That sounds like a more productive and less confrontational way to develop regulations, potentially. Now, what about direct oversight from Congress and the president? How do they keep tabs on the vast bureaucracy day to day?
Well, Congress has significant oversight power through several key levers. One of the most fundamental is its power of the purse. Exactly. Congress controls the funding that bureaucratic agencies receive each year. By carefully scrutinizing agency budget requests and making decisions about appropriations, Congress can significantly influence what agencies can and cannot do.
Control the budget, control the agency.
To a large extent, yes. Another important tool is the Senate's authority to approve presidential appointments to head cabinet departments and independent agencies. This confirmation process allows Congress to examine the qualifications and policy views of potential agency leaders.
The confirmation hearings, right?
Yep. Additionally, bureaucratic agencies are typically required to submit annual reports on their activities and performance to Congress, and congressional committees regularly hold oversight hearings where they can question agency leaders about their operations, policies, and any potential problems.
Can those get heated?
Oh, absolutely. These hearings can range from routine fact-finding missions to much more intense scrutiny, especially when an agency has been involved in a significant controversy, as we saw with the congressional scrutiny of the IRS in 2013 regarding its handling of applications for tax-exempt status from political groups.
I remember that.
Perhaps Congress's most powerful oversight arm is the Government Accountability Office, GAO.
The GAO, what do they do?
Often referred to as Congress's watchdog, the GAO is an independent, nonpartisan agency that provides auditing, evaluation, and investigative services to Congress. They produce hundreds of reports each year on a wide range of government activities.
Hundreds?
From the efficiency of defense spending to the effectiveness of healthcare programs and the security of homeland security measures. These GAO reports provide crucial fact-based information that Congress can use to inform its oversight efforts and to identify areas where improvements are needed.
So the GAO is like Congress's independent investigative arm that helps them keep an eye on things. Makes sense. What about the president's role in overseeing the bureaucracy? How does the White House manage it?
The president also exercises significant oversight through several key channels. As we mentioned, the power to appoint the heads of the 15 cabinet departments and numerous independent executive agencies, subject to Senate confirmation, is a crucial tool. The president can select individuals who share their policy goals and management philosophy.
Setting the tone from the top.
Right. Another incredibly important entity within the executive branch for bureaucratic oversight is the Office of Management and Budget, OMB.
OMB, they handle the budget, right?
They do, but much more than that. The OMB has a very broad mandate. It's responsible for producing the president's annual budget proposal to Congress, but its role extends far beyond that. The OMB also serves as a key point of contact between the president and the various executive branch agencies. It reviews and reports to the president on the activities and performance of these agencies, coordinates and reviews federal regulations to ensure they align with the president's priorities, and issues executive orders and presidential directives that can shape how agencies operate. It's a real power center.
It sounds like there are multiple layers of oversight from both the legislative and executive branches, checking budgets, appointments, holding hearings. But what about the average citizen? Do we have any real way to provide oversight or hold the bureaucracy accountable? Can you do anything?
Yes, actually. In response to a growing public skepticism about government power and a desire for greater transparency, several important laws have been enacted to enable citizen oversight of the bureaucracy.
Like what?
Two of the most significant are the Freedom of Information Act of 1966, FOIA,
FOIA, yes.
and the Government and Sunshine Act of 1976. FOIA gives any member of the public, as well as journalists and organizations, a legally enforceable right to request access to records held by federal government agencies.
You can just ask for records?
Generally, yes. Agencies are required to disclose this information unless it falls under specific exemptions designed to protect sensitive information related to national security, personal privacy, ongoing law enforcement investigations, and certain other categories.
So there are limits.
There are. But FOIA also requires federal agencies to proactively post certain types of information online, making it publicly accessible without a specific request.
Okay, so FOIA is about accessing documents. What's the Sunshine Act?
The Government and Sunshine Act takes a different approach to transparency. It mandates that meetings of multi-headed federal agencies, those governed by a board or commission, must be open to public observation.
Open meeting.
Exactly.
Okay.
This is based on the principle that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and that open meetings help to ensure accountability. There are, of course, exceptions to this requirement for discussions involving classified information, proprietary business data, and other sensitive topics.
Makes sense.
Beyond these laws, citizens also have the opportunity to participate directly in the rulemaking process by submitting comments on proposed regulations and by testifying at public hearings held by agencies on various issues.
So these laws are really about trying to increase transparency and give the public a window into the workings of the bureaucracy. Now let's talk about another approach to managing government functions: government privatization. How does that concept fit into the overall picture of controlling or influencing the bureaucracy? Is it about shrinking it?
Well, government privatization involves incorporating market-based principles and the resources of the private sector into the delivery of government services or the performance of government functions. It's a strategy that has been implemented to varying degrees in the United States, although it has historically been less widespread here compared to some other countries.
Wireless here.
It's complicated, related to our specific history and political culture, but there are several different forms that privatization can take,
It says.
including the government, contracting with private companies to provide specific services, issuing government vouchers that citizens can use to purchase services from private providers, awarding grants to private organizations to run government-funded programs, forming public-private partnerships to finance and operate infrastructure projects, and even fully divesting the government of a particular function and transferring it entirely to the private sector.
Full divestiture sounds like a pretty significant step. Selling off a government function entirely. Are there many examples of that happening at the federal level?
Complete divestiture at the federal level is relatively rare. One example that's often cited is Sallie Mae, the Student Loan Marketing Association, which was initially a government-sponsored entity that dealt with federal student loans, but eventually became a fully private corporation.
Ah, Sallie Mae.
Right.
We see more examples of full privatization at the state and local levels, such as with the privatization of some toll roads or water and wastewater utilities. However, the most prominent form of privatization at the federal level is contracting.
Hiring outside companies.
Exactly, where the government pays private companies to perform specific tasks or provide services. This practice has grown significantly in recent decades, particularly under Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush. A well-known example is the large-scale use of private contractors like Kellogg Brown and Root to provide logistical and support services to the military during the Iraq War.
KBR.
While contracting can sometimes offer benefits in terms of flexibility and specialized expertise, it has also faced criticism regarding its cost-effectiveness and the potential for waste and even corruption. Right. The oversight can be tricky.
It can be. Another more complex form is third-party financing, where the government and a private entity might form a special purpose vehicle to finance a large infrastructure project. But these arrangements have also been criticized for their complexity and potential for increased long-term costs.
So privatization is another tool, another strategy that the government can use to try and manage its functions, sometimes as a response to perceived inefficiencies or a desire to leverage private sector expertise. Finally, what about oversight that comes from within the bureaucracy itself? Are there internal checks and balances, people watching each other?
Yes, internal oversight mechanisms are absolutely critical because individuals working within a bureaucracy are often in the best position to recognize instances of misconduct, inefficiency, or waste.
The insiders.
Exactly. However, there can also be significant risks and challenges for those insiders who choose to report such problems. Blowing the whistle isn't easy.
Right, retaliation concerns.
Precisely. To address this, whistleblower protections have been established in law. The Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 was a landmark piece of legislation that created specific rights and protections for federal employees who report waste, fraud, and abuse within the government.
So protections exist.
Yes, and it also established the Merit Systems Protection Board, MSPB, which we mentioned earlier, as an independent agency to handle complaints and conduct investigations related to whistleblower retaliation. These initial protections have been strengthened over the years through subsequent legislation, such as the Whistleblower Protection Act of 1989 and the Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act of 2012, which expanded the scope of protected disclosures and made it easier for whistleblowers to seek redress if they face reprisals for reporting wrongdoing.
So the laws have tried to keep up.
They've tried. A recent and highly publicized example that highlights the public interest in whistleblower protections was the case of the 2019 whistleblower who raised concerns related to the Trump administration's interactions with Ukraine, ultimately leading to impeachment proceedings. That brought the issue right back into the spotlight.
Right. It's been a truly comprehensive deep dive into the world of bureaucracy, its history, its structure, the different types, the people, and the constant efforts to oversee and control it. To bring it all together, what are the main takeaways or transformations that stand out to you from this whole story?
Well, we've really traced a remarkable evolution, haven't we? From a relatively small and, frankly, politically driven system under the spoils system
Right.
to the massive, complex administrative structure we have today, which strives, at least in principle, for merit-based principles while constantly navigating the push and pull of political direction and public scrutiny. Understanding this complex entity is absolutely fundamental to understanding how our government actually functions on a daily basis and how it impacts virtually every aspect of our lives.
It really does touch everything. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one final thought-provoking question you'd like to leave our listeners with as they reflect on all of this? Something to chew on.
Well, given the inherent and ongoing tensions between the need for political direction and accountability in a democracy
Yeah.
and the value of specialized expertise and professional independence within the bureaucracy.
That core conflict.
Right. What do you believe is the ideal balance? How do we best ensure both effective governance and responsiveness to the needs and desires of the public in our modern, complex world? It's a question with no easy answers, but one that's absolutely crucial for the health and functioning of our democratic system.